The gravel road bit at Dean's tires, each crunch a dull percussion against the drone of the engine. The drive had been long, the landscape outside the window blurring into an indistinguishable wash of gray-green and overcast sky. Fatigue clung to him, a heavy shroud woven from sleepless nights and the pervasive weight of a life that felt increasingly devoid of direction. His professional endeavors had stalled, a once promising career now a stagnant pond. Personal loss had carved deeper, leaving an ache that no amount of distance or time seemed capable of dulling. This inheritance, this dilapidated manor, felt less like a gift and more like a final, ironic jest from a woman he barely knew. His grandmother had been a distant figure, a name whispered in hushed tones during his childhood, a photograph gathering dust in a seldom opened album. Their last interaction years ago had been brief, strained, and utterly forgettable. Now he was here, summoned by death to a place he had never seen, tasked with sifting through the detritus of a stranger's life. A grim determination, born of sheer exhaustion, propelled him forward. He would clear the place, sell it, and attempt to regain some semblance of control over his own narrative. The tree line thickened, ancient oaks and gnarled elms reaching skeletal branches across the sky, their leaves a muted rustle against the wind. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Then, through a break in the foliage, the manor appeared. It was not merely old, it was ancient, a hulking silhouette against the bruised sky, its stone façade stained with time and neglect. Windows, dark and vacant, stared out like hollow eyes. Overgrown ivy clawed at the walls, a parasitic embrace that threatened to consume the structure entirely. A wrought iron gate, rusted and half off its hinges, guarded the entrance to what had once been a sweeping drive. He parked the car, its engine ticking softly in the sudden quiet, a lone mechanical heartbeat in a world that felt suddenly devoid of life. The air was thick, carrying the faint, cloying sweetness of rot beneath the sharper tang of damp stone. The front door, a heavy slab of scarred oak, yielded with a groan that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the house. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of dust, mildew, and something else. Something indefinable. A faint metallic tang that prickled at the back of his throat. Dean flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting a hesitant path through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, a silent, swirling ballet. Cobwebs draped from unseen corners like tattered mourning veils. Furniture, shrouded in white sheets, stood like an assembly of forgotten ghosts. He moved deeper, his footsteps echoing unnaturally on the bare floorboards. Each creak, each rustle of fabric, seemed amplified in the suffocating quiet. He felt a peculiar sense of intrusion, as if he had stumbled into a tomb that was not meant to be disturbed. He began his survey in what appeared to be a study, a room lined with towering, empty bookshelves and a massive, dust-laden desk. He pulled back a sheet from a small, ornate side table, revealing its carved mahogany surface. Beneath it, wedged precariously against a stack of brittle, leather-bound books, lay a small, tarnished silver object. It was a metal canister, perhaps for film. Inside, rolled tightly, was a single faded ticket stub. The printing was almost illegible, but the words "Old Cinema" were still faintly visible, a ghost of entertainment from a bygone era. He set the stub down, the oddity of its presence here a minor point in the overwhelming decay. The fireplace was a gaping maw, black and sooty. He knelt, pushing aside the brittle fabric. There, nestled amongst the debris, lay a small, intricately carved wooden box. The craftsmanship was exquisite, a stark contrast to the surrounding decay. His fingers traced the delicate carvings, feeling the cool, smooth surface. A tiny brass key protruded from a winding mechanism on its side. Curiosity, a rare visitor in his weary mind, stirred within him. He turned the key. A faint internal click, then a series of whirring gears. The lid, hinged at the back, slowly lifted. A small porcelain ballerina, frozen in an eternal pirouette, rotated slowly. And then the music began. It was a melody of delicate beauty initially. A lullaby, perhaps, or a forgotten waltz. But almost immediately, a subtle discord entered, a wavering note, a fractional hesitation in the rhythm. The notes seemed to stretch, to pull, to fray at the edges, creating an undercurrent of unease that resonated deep within him. The melody continued, a warped echo of something innocent, now tinged with an unsettling, almost mournful quality. He felt the hair on his arms prickle. The manor rose from the overgrown landscape like a forgotten monument, its gables sharp against the bruised sky. Dean cut the engine, the sudden silence heavy, broken only by the faint rustle of dry leaves. The fatigue that had clung to him throughout the drive now morphed into a dull pressure behind his eyes. He unfolded himself from the driver's seat, his movements stiff, and surveyed the edifice. It was larger than photographs suggested, a sprawling gray stone structure with too many windows, many of them dark, like vacant eyes. A single gnarled oak stood sentinel near the crumbling porch, its branches skeletal. He moved through the cavernous entrance hall, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. This was simply a task, a clearing out. He began his methodical sweep, starting with the ground floor. The drawing room was a tableau of decay, furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts, a grand piano lid closed, its keys undoubtedly yellowed. It was a miniature carousel, intricately carved horses frozen mid-gallop, painted in faded golds and blues. He picked it up, the brass cool beneath his fingers, the craftsmanship exquisite despite the grime. He placed it carefully on a clear patch of floor, making a mental note. Moving deeper, Dean found himself in what must have been a study. Leather-bound books lined shelves, their spines cracked, their pages foxed. This one was simpler, a lacquered wooden rectangle adorned with a single silver key. Its surface was smooth, almost unnervingly so beneath the film of dust. He collected it, adding it to his growing array. The sheer number of them was peculiar, a specific obsession his grandmother had never shared, or at least never with him. As he worked, a subtle shift in the air became noticeable. He blinked, turning his head sharply, but saw only the static play of light and shadow from the windows. Fatigue, he told himself, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. The old house settling. He continued his exploration, pushing open a heavy, unlatched door at the far end of a long corridor. The room beyond surprised him. It was a large, windowless space, dominated by rows of worn velvet seats facing a blank wall. A projector booth, its glass panel opaque with dust, loomed at the rear. This was the old cinema, a peculiar addition to a private residence. It was here, on the small stage where a screen might once have hung, that he found the fifth music box. It was shaped like a tiny proscenium arch, complete with miniature red velvet curtains that were stiff with age. A small porcelain ballerina, her arms poised, stood within. He picked up the cinema music box, its weight substantial. The ballerina inside, with her chipped paint and vacant stare, seemed to watch him. He found himself drawn to the small winding key on its side, a strange compulsion overriding his growing apprehension. He turned the key, feeling the click of the mechanism. The music box chimed to life, a delicate, almost ethereal melody at first. But quickly, the notes began to warp, stretching thin, then thickening, like taffy pulled too far. It was the same unsettling distortion he'd heard from the first box he'd encountered earlier, but this time, it felt more pronounced, more insistent. The ballerina inside began to spin, her movements jerky, unnatural. As the distorted tune filled the old cinema, the subtle disturbances intensified. The house was not merely settling, it was reacting. And the music box, spinning its unsettling tune, felt like the conductor of this disquieting symphony. The manor's silence pressed in, a physical weight. Dean sat in the dusty parlor, the two music boxes from the previous day resting on a draped side table. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on the flickering shadow cast by a distant bare bulb in the hallway. The house was old, he reasoned. Settling. The creaks and groans were simply the timber contracting, the wind whistling through ill-fitting frames. The faint, almost imperceptible whispers he'd imagined were echoes of a tired mind, exacerbated by the isolation and the sheer volume of his grandmother's accumulated life. He had been under immense stress recently, the legal wrangling over the estate a tedious, draining affair following his own recent profound loss. His perception was likely skewed. He spent the remainder of the afternoon systematically searching the ground floor. The study, in particular, was a mausoleum of forgotten papers. Stacks of ledgers, correspondence brittle with age, and a bewildering assortment of journals filled with his grandmother's precise looping script. Dean sifted through them, seeking anything that might explain his peculiar reclusiveness, or perhaps the unsettling atmosphere of the house itself. The air in the study was thick with the scent of dried ink and decaying paper, a smell that clung to his clothes and hair. Amongst tax documents and utility bills dating back decades, he uncovered a small, leather-bound album. The cover was scarred, the gold tooling faded. Inside, sepia-toned photographs depicted his grandmother in various stages of her life. A stern young woman, a vibrant middle-aged presence, and finally, a gaunt, distant figure. They showed her standing in what appeared to be the manor's neglected garden, but her focus was always drawn away, toward a particular section of the overgrown wall. Her expression in these later images was not one of simple age, but of profound preoccupation, almost obsession. In one, her eyes, though faded in the print, seemed to fix on something beyond the frame, a tension in her shoulders. Tucked between the last two pages of the album was a folded piece of parchment. It was not a photograph, but a hand-drawn sketch, roughly rendered, depicting what looked like a section of a wall with an archway, partially obscured by vines. Beneath it, a single hurried inscription in his grandmother's hand. The sound guides the way, before the final curtain falls. The script was shakier than in her earlier journals, the ink smudged in places. Dean stared at the drawing, then back at the photographs. The archway in the sketch bore a striking resemblance to a structure he'd glimpsed in the distance beyond the garden, almost hidden by a thicket of overgrown ivy. A hidden room, or perhaps a forgotten folly. Further into the papers, he located a small, unassuming envelope. Inside, a single crisp ticket stub. It was for the old cinema, dated decades ago. It was a singular, isolated detail, an incongruous fragment in a life seemingly devoid of public entertainment. He filed it away in his mind, another loose thread in the tapestry of his grandmother's past. He paused his research as dusk began to bleed through the grimy windows. The faint scent of something like damp earth and old lace seemed to emanate from the very walls now, not just the papers. A third box sat on the mantelpiece in the main drawing room, overlooked until now amidst the clutter. He noted the small, tarnished silver key nestled in its side. He wound the mechanism, the clicks louder, more resonant than before. A slow, deliberate melody began to unfold. It started with a deceptively gentle, almost lullaby-like progression, but it quickly veered into dissonance. Notes bent, stretched, and then snapped back into place. Not quite right. A sustained, reedy tone emerged, like a voice attempting to hum a tune it couldn't quite recall, each breath catching. It wasn't just distorted, it felt wrong, a deliberate twisting of harmony. Dean felt a prickle on his skin, a subtle tightening in his chest. He watched the tiny ballerina inside pirouette. Her movements graceful, yet her painted smile seemed fixed, almost menacing in the dim light. He set the box down, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. He attributed the sensation to fatigue, the strain of the day. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a release. The air was frigid, biting at his exposed skin. A faint, repetitive thrumming sound echoed from somewhere deep within the unseen architecture, a vibration that resonated in his teeth. Then, a shift. The corridor warped, twisting into a narrow, winding passage. The thrumming intensified, accompanied by the faint, high-pitched whine that had been present in the last music box. He could feel something moving just beyond his line of sight, a presence that was not seen but profoundly felt. He wanted to run, but his feet were rooted. The memory of the music box's unsettling melody was still vibrant, playing a silent, distorted symphony in the echoing chambers of his consciousness. Settling, every creak, every groan was merely the wood expanding, contracting. A draft, an old house. He repeated the words internally, a mantra against the creeping unease that had begun to burrow deep into his consciousness. Dean's head snapped around. Nothing. The parlor remained still, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten dust. He stood, walking to the window, pushing aside a heavy, moth-eaten curtain. Outside, the twilight deepened, painting the overgrown gardens in shades of bruised purple. Later, in the kitchen, as he attempted to prepare a meager meal, the sensation intensified. A distant clatter, like ceramic striking wood, echoed from the floor above. He froze, spatula halfway to the pan. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. No reply. He waited, listening to the frantic thrum of his own pulse. The sound did not repeat. That night, the dream came with a vivid clarity that mocked the line between sleep and waking. He stood in an old cinema, the red velvet seats ripped and faded, the air heavy with the scent of stale popcorn and decay. The images shifted, accelerating, showing his professional failures, the empty promises, the slow erosion of his ambition. Too weak. The words coiled around him, tightening, suffocating. He tried to move, to shout, but his limbs were leaden. The following morning, the entity's presence was no longer subtle. Dean descended the grand staircase, his hand trailing along the banister. A book, a heavy tome on botany, lay open on the fourth step. He distinctly remembered leaving it on a shelf in the library 2 floors below. He picked it up, feeling its weight, and placed it back on the shelf, a deliberate act of defiance against the growing chaos. He knelt to retrieve them, his fingers trembling. As he gathered the last envelope, a small, ornate music box, one he hadn't seen before, clattered from beneath the desk, landing with a soft thud beside his hand. This was the reveal discovery, a new, unsettling music box, seemingly placed for him to find. He turned the key. It was a woman's voice, laced with sorrow, yet utterly devoid of warmth. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The study was empty. He was alone. Or he should have been. Suddenly, a framed portrait of his grandfather, hanging precariously on the wall, shuddered. The glass cracked, a spiderweb of fissures spreading from the center. Then, with a sharp, violent crack, the entire frame flew from the wall, striking the opposite wall with incredible force before falling to the floor, shattering into splinters. This was the event. Dean stumbled backward, tripping over a discarded rug, landing hard on his back. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an explanation, a rational cause. There was none. His determination, once a steady flame, now flickered precariously. He was no longer just clearing out a house, he was trapped within it. The entity wasn't just lurking, it was actively tormenting him, pushing him, testing his sanity. He felt increasingly isolated, the vastness of the manor amplifying his solitude. His grip on reality, once firm, now felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He knew with a terrifying certainty that he was being watched, observed, and slowly, meticulously driven to the edge. The house was old, he reasoned. The electricity was faulty. Yet a cold tremor traced his spine, a sensation distinct from the manor's chill. He felt observed, not by an animal or a draft, but by something acutely aware. He needed answers, and the house held them. He rose, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The parlor offered no obvious secrets. Its furniture, draped in white sheets like slumbering ghosts, yielded only dust and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten potpourri. He moved to the adjacent study, a room dominated by a massive, ornate desk. Its drawers were stiff, resisting his efforts, until one, with a sudden splintering crack, gave way. Inside, nestled beneath a pile of brittle tax documents from decades past, he found it. A small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was blank, its pages thin and yellowed. Dean carried the journal back to the parlor, a sliver of light from a grimy window illuminating its fragile script. The handwriting was neat, elegant, yet the words themselves spoke of a profound, escalating despair. The entries, dated from nearly a century ago, belonged to a woman named Alara. They say she's ill. They say she's weak, but Dean see his eyes, so much like mine, trapped within these walls. My poor, sweet sister Isolde, hidden away. Dean's breath hitched. Isolde. His grandmother had been an only child, or so he'd been told. They make her forget. The melodies. They twist what was once good. They steal her. A stage for forgotten sorrow. He thought of the old cinema on the edge of town, long abandoned, its marquee a skeletal grin. His grandmother had occasionally mentioned it, always with a peculiar, distant sadness. The manor's secrets were bleeding into the outside world. He grabbed his coat, the journal clutched in his hand, and stepped out into the biting afternoon air. The drive to the old cinema was short, yet felt interminable. The sky was a bruised purple, promising an early dusk. The old cinema stood like a derelict monument to faded glamour. Its façade was crumbling, posters from decades past peeling in tattered strips. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the cloying sweetness of decay. The lobby was a cavern of shattered glass and overturned popcorn machines, their yellowed plastic skins cracked. The main auditorium was vast, the seats ripped and stained, the velvet curtains on the stage shredded like ancient wounds. The air grew heavy, pressing in on him. He aimed his light at the stage. They were the same intricate geometric patterns etched onto the music boxes. It was not a word, but a sound, like dry leaves skittering across concrete, yet it was undeniably close, intimate. Dean whirled, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the empty seats. Nothing. But the temperature in the room plummeted, the air growing so frigid his breath plumed in front of him. Then, a flicker. It was impossibly tall, slender, and seemed to drink the light around it. A low, guttural hum, like a cello string stretched to breaking, vibrated through the floorboards, through his very bones. The sound intensified, a cacophony of distorted melodies, each note familiar, yet horribly wrong, as if every music box he'd ever wound was playing at once, out of sync, in anguish. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his head, a scream tearing from his throat. He understood. The forgotten sister. The music boxes weren't just for distraction. They were instruments of a ritual, designed to capture, to contain, to feed. And now, after all these years, he had set her free. Or worse, he had woken the thing that had fed on her. He had to get out. He had driven past it countless times, a crumbling monument to forgotten glamour, never imagining it held any significance beyond its decaying facade. Now, a cold prickle traced his scalp. The air in the study felt heavy, thick with the scent of aged paper and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like rust mixed with a forgotten perfume. He closed the journal, its brittle cover protesting with a dry rasp. This was it, a direct clue. A way out, perhaps, or at least a path to understanding. He needed to go to the old cinema. A sudden, irrational urge to smash the music box on the desk seized him. It sat there, innocent in its ornate carving, yet its presence felt like a constant thrum beneath his skin, a parasitic vibration. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the cool, polished wood. He hesitated. Destroying it might be a mistake. What if it was a key, not just a trigger? The entity's connection to the boxes was undeniable, but its true nature remained elusive. No, the priority was to get out, to reach the old cinema. Dean turned, striding from the study into the main hall. He moved with purpose, the floorboards groaning under his weight, each creak echoing through the cavernous space. He twisted. It didn't budge. He tried again, putting more force into it, a grunt escaping his lips. The knob remained stubbornly fixed. He pushed against the heavy wood, then pulled, shoulders straining. The door was sealed shut, as if it had become part of the wall itself. "What in the hell?" he muttered, his voice sounding thin in the vast hall. He stepped back, surveying the door. There was no lock visible, no bolt. It simply would not open. He moved to the nearest window, a tall, arched pane of glass looking out onto the overgrown front garden. He pushed at the sash, then tried to lift it. It was painted shut, or seemed to be. He put his full weight into it, knuckles whitening. The wood didn't give. The glass felt unnaturally thick, unyielding. He tried another window, then another. All the same, this wasn't just old age or neglect. This felt deliberate. He moved rapidly through the ground floor, checking every window, every door. The back door, leading to the disused kitchen and then the rear garden, was similarly unyielding. The cellar door, which he hadn't dared to explore properly yet, was not just locked, but felt like it had been welded to its frame. He ascended the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Perhaps an upper window, less frequently used, would give way. He tried the windows in the master bedroom, then the guest rooms, then the small, forgotten attic access. Each one was an immovable barrier. It was as if the house had decided, with a silent, terrible will, to hold him within its crumbling embrace. A faint, almost imperceptible melody drifted from downstairs. It seemed to coil around him, a delicate, insidious thread. Trapped. He was truly trapped. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath. The house was not just a container for the entity. It was an extension of it, or perhaps the entity was the house. And it was actively preventing his escape. A subtle shift in the light, a barely there flicker, suggested a presence. The melody from downstairs grew stronger, almost triumphant. Dean pushed himself away from the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He was not just imprisoned, he was being consumed. The entity was not merely present, it was growing, fattening itself on his rising panic. But the house, his grandmother's house, was now a cage, and he was the prey. The skeletal remains of its marquee, a mangled crown of rusted metal, scraped against the bruised twilight sky. Years of disuse had warped the once vibrant façade into a grimace of peeling paint and shattered glass. A chill, sharper than the evening air, settled in Dean's chest. This was it. He pushed open a side door, the groan of protesting hinges ripping through the oppressive silence. He swept the beam across the ticket booth, its glass long gone, then the concession stand, still littered with desiccated popcorn kernels and forgotten candy wrappers. A flicker at the edge of his vision. A fleeting impression of a woman in a cloche hat, her back to him, made him whip his head around. Nothing. Only the crumbling plaster and the pervasive gloom. He ascended the grand staircase, its red velvet carpet long since worn to threads, the banisters sticky with grime. Each step was a creaking complaint. At the top, a narrow hallway led to the projection booth. The door hung ajar, revealing a cramped space filled with hulking, obsolete machinery. The air here was even heavier, charged with a strange, static energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He ran a hand over the cold metal, a profound sense of isolation washing over him. Then, a low hum began, a resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath his feet. The hum intensified, a deep, guttural thrum that vibrated through his bones. Dean's vision blurred. The projector's reels began to spin, slow at first, then faster, though no film was loaded. A faint sepia-toned light spilled from the lens, bathing the back wall in an impossible glow. On that wall, a scene unfolded. It wasn't a memory, not exactly, but a vision, impossibly real. The cinema's auditorium below him was no longer derelict. Rows of velvet seats were filled with indistinct figures, their forms shimmering like heat haze. Laughter, soft and distant, drifted up, punctuated by the rustle of programs. Dean saw his grandmother, younger, vibrant, sitting in the front row, his face alight with an expression he had never witnessed in life. Joy, untainted. He wanted to call out, to touch his grandmother, but his voice caught in his throat. Then, the laughter shifted. It became strained, a brittle, desperate sound that grated on his nerves. The figures in the seats began to twist, their faces elongating, their smiles stretching into grotesque rictus grins. The hum in the room became a scream, tearing at the edges of Dean's sanity. A voice, insidious and silken, slithered into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. Such sorrow, such a feast. They never truly leave, do they? Dean stumbled back, his head throbbing. The vision flickered, dissolved, and then reformed, this time showing only his grandmother, alone on the stage below, illuminated by a single harsh spotlight. He was weeping, her shoulders shaking, her hands clasped as if in prayer. She sought to understand, to control, foolish. She sought to complete it, the last act. But her will faltered. Hymn's sorrow was not enough. Dean gasped, pressing a hand to his temple. The projector, silent again, seemed to mock him. He scanned the small booth, his eyes darting wildly. He noticed a loose panel beneath a shelf, barely visible behind a stack of old film canisters. With trembling fingers, he pried it open. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs, was a rolled-up parchment. He pulled it out, unfurling it carefully. It was a faded blueprint, a detailed stage design, intricately drawn. Symbols he recognized from the journal, cryptic and unsettling, were scrawled across it, marking specific points on the stage, the wings, even the orchestra pit. At the top, in his grandmother's elegant hand, was a title: The Grand Finale, a requiem for memory. His breath hitched. The old cinema, a stage for forgotten sorrow. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was literal. The ritual. It was meant to be performed here. A stage for the unveiling, for the convergence. Your sorrow, Dean, is a deeper well. Complete what he could not. Release them. Dean felt his own memories begin to fray at the edges, his perception of the present blurring with the echoes of the past. The stage design wasn't just a plan. It was an invitation, a terrifying map to a ritual that promised to consume everything he was, everything he had. The entity was not merely speaking to him. It was beginning to seep into him, its desires becoming an insidious current beneath his own thoughts. The blueprint, now a tattered map of dread, had led Dean away from the manor, through a landscape growing steadily more desolate. The wind, which had always whispered secrets through the gables of his inherited home, here howled with a raw, predatory hunger. It tugged at his coat, pushing him toward the skeletal remains of what had once been a grand structure, the old cinema. Its marquee, a rusted grin of broken bulbs, sagged precariously above a collapsed entrance. Dean's hand, slick with nervous sweat, tightened around the flashlight he carried, its beam a fragile spear against the encroaching gloom. He navigated a maze of collapsed seating, rows of tattered fabric chairs like forgotten specters. The blueprint had indicated a specific point on the stage itself, a symbol etched precisely where the proscenium arch met the floor. Dean pushed through a heavy velvet curtain, its once rich crimson now a faded, brittle shroud. He stepped onto the stage. The stage floorboards groaned under his weight, a chorus of ancient protest. He swept the beam across the vast empty space, the ghost of an audience palpable in the stillness. Directly beneath the symbolic mark on the blueprint, a section of the floorboards appeared slightly disturbed, a faint discoloration marking its edges. Dean knelt, his fingers tracing the outline of the seam. With a grunt, he wedged his fingers into a crack and pried. The wood splintered, releasing a puff of acrid dust, but the board shifted. Beneath it, nestled in a shallow cavity, lay a series of aged, leather-bound journals. Their covers were warped, the pages brittle with time. He opened the first, the faint scent of dried ink mingling with the cinema's decay. The handwriting was elegant, looping, but frantic in places. It belonged to a performer, a singer, whose entries described a burgeoning career, then a growing unease. The audience, their eyes, they don't just watch, they feed. The director, he encourages it. He flipped through the pages, glimpsing sketches of strange, intricate mechanisms, designs strikingly similar to the music boxes. The journal detailed a ritual of remembrance, a performance intended to capture the essence of devotion. But it had gone horribly wrong. The music boxes, Dean now understood, were not merely triggers. They were anchors. Each one, exquisitely crafted, was designed to resonate with a specific facet of human emotion: joy, sorrow, fear, wonder. The fragmented, distorted melodies were not accidental. They were the echoes of those trapped emotions, the essence of the forgotten. The entity was not a ghost in the traditional sense, but a monstrous amalgamation of these stolen feelings, given shape and malevolent will by the director's perversion. It fed on memory, not just to exist, but to grow. His grandmother's role became sickeningly clear in the later entries. He had been a colleague of the director, initially drawn in by the promise of a unique artistic endeavor. Her despair, her guilt, her attempts to undo what had been done, they were all here, scrawled in a different hand on loose, folded pages tucked into the final journal. He had tried to dismantle the ritual, to break the anchors, but the entity had already taken root. It had become too powerful, its hunger insatiable. He had collected the music boxes, not to preserve them, but to contain the fragments of the entity, scattering them in the hopes that no one would ever reassemble them. And Dean. His own grief, his personal loss, the way he clung to fragmented memories of his family. He was the perfect, unwitting catalyst. The entity, weakened but not destroyed, had sensed his despair, his vulnerability, drawing him to the manor, compelling him to wind the music boxes, to feed it. His own memories, slowly being consumed, were merely the first course. The ritual, long abandoned, sought to complete itself through him, using his life force, his connection to the manor's legacy, to solidify its hold on the world, to manifest fully. A low hum, not from the cinema's ancient electrical system, but from deep within the stage itself, vibrated through the floorboards. It was the same unsettling resonance he had heard from the music boxes, amplified 1,000-fold. The metallic tang in the air intensified, sharp and coppery. He was not merely an observer, he was the final component. The entity was not just feeding on his memories, it was preparing to become him. The final stage of the ritual was about to begin. The journal lay open on the dusty floor, its brittle pages whispering of a ritual of remembrance, a performance intended to capture the essence. Dean stared at the words, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. The essence. Whose? And for what purpose? A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound he felt rather than heard, originating from deep within the manor's foundations. It was a resonant frequency, a tuning fork struck against his very bones. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid like burnt sugar. Shadows stretched and contracted, no longer merely cast by the dwindling daylight, but possessing an independent liquid life. The portraits on the walls, usually benign in their faded grandeur, now seemed to twist, their painted eyes following his every movement, their expressions shifting from serene to accusatory. Dean clutched the journal, its rough binding digging into his palm. He needed to understand, to fight, but the sheer weight of the encroaching malevolence pressed down on him, a physical burden. A faint melody, distorted and fractured, drifted from the hallway. It was the music box tune, but amplified, echoing with an unnatural resonance. It wasn't playing from a single box. It was as if every surface, every particle of dust, was vibrating with the fragmented notes. He was a marionette, and the entity held the strings. The grand staircase, once a symbol of the manor's past opulence, now seemed to contort. The banister writhed like a desiccated vine, and the steps stretched into an impossible ascent, each riser a gaping maw. It was reaching, probing, seeking the fragile seams of his composure. Memories, sharp and vivid, flashed before his eyes. The quiet comfort of his childhood home, the warm embrace of a loved one, the sting of a professional failure. They were not his memories now, but reflections, warped and distorted, played back to him through a funhouse mirror. He saw his own face, contorted in fear, reflected in the polished surface of a grandfather clock that suddenly appeared in the hallway, its hands spinning wildly, then stopping abruptly at a time that wasn't real. The entity was not just showing him these things. It was feeding on his emotional responses, growing stronger with each spike of fear, each pang of regret. The melody intensified, leading him towards a part of the manor he hadn't fully explored. Beyond it lay a vast, cavernous space, swallowed by decay. It was an old cinema. And on the pedestal, gleaming faintly in the gloom, was the final music box. It was larger than the others, intricately carved with figures that seemed to writhe and contort, mirroring the entity's insidious presence. Its lid was open, revealing a mechanism of astonishing complexity, its tiny cogs and springs waiting, expectant. The essence, the final note, completion. It was not a plea, but a command, delivered with the crushing weight of inevitability. Dean felt his will fraying, his determination eroding under the relentless assault. He understood now. The ritual of remembrance wasn't just about capturing an essence. It was about transferring it, perhaps even birthing something. The music boxes were not just instruments. They were conduits, each playing a note in a symphony designed to unlock a door, to bring something into full being. He stumbled forward, his feet dragging through the debris of the old cinema. His mind screamed in protest, but his body moved with a horrifying autonomy. He knew what awaited him at that pedestal. He knew that activating the final box would be the culmination of the entity's sinister plan, the point of no return. Yet the pressure was immense, an unseen hand pushing him, guiding him, compelling him. His fingers twitched, aching to grasp the winding key, to bring the final terrible melody to life. His entire being rebelled, But the entity had woven itself into his thoughts, his very impulses. The air thrummed, the decayed cinema seemed to breathe around him, and the final music box on the stage beckoned, its intricate mechanism a gaping maw, ready to consume the last vestiges of his will. The low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a guttural thrumming that resonated in Dean's teeth. The journal lay open, its revelations cold and stark. Ritual of remembrance. Capture the essence. Whose essence? The question echoed, a frantic bird trapped in his skull. The entity wasn't just feeding, it was building. It wasn't merely a specter of the past, it sought to solidify its existence, to bridge the gap between spectral and corporeal, using the very grief it cultivated. This was not about haunting. It was about rebirth. His determination, brittle yet unwavering, sharpened into a desperate point. He would sever this connection, break this cycle, whatever the cost. The hum intensified, pulling him, not towards the manor's familiar decay, but a direction he hadn't yet explored. It stood, a monument to forgotten pleasure, its Art Deco façade crumbling, paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The marquee, once vibrant, now hung askew, its letters long gone. A faint, sweet scent, like stale popcorn mixed with mildew and something metallic, drifted from its gaping double doors. The hum was deafening here, a tangible pressure against his eardrums. He pushed through the doors, which groaned in protest, releasing a plume of dust that caught the weak light filtering through grimy windows. Inside, the lobby was a cavern of ghosts. Velvet ropes lay rotted on the floor, ticket stubs scattered like fallen leaves. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, a pervasive, cloying sweetness that made his stomach churn. Dean stepped over overturned seats, his boots crunching on debris, his gaze fixed on the entrance to the main auditorium. The hum pulsed, a frantic heartbeat. He pushed through another set of doors, heavier this time, and entered the vast, silent space. The old cinema. Rows of tattered seats, once plush, now resembled deflated husks, their fabric ripped, springs exposed. On the stage below, amidst more debris, stood a collection of objects that made Dean's breath catch. The music boxes. All of them. Arranged in a semicircle, their intricate designs glinted dully. And in the center, a single towering contraption, unlike any of the others. It pulsed with a faint internal light, and from its depths emanated the distorted, siren-like melody that had haunted his nights. Dean clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe, to focus. He knew what it wanted. His grief, his raw, unedited sorrow. The colossal music box began to turn, its exposed gears grinding with an almost organic sound. The melody amplified, no longer subtle, but a cacophony of distorted notes, each one a tendril reaching for his mind. Images flashed before his eyes. His wife's smile, the last time he held his child. Moments of joy now tainted with a profound, aching loss. Dean understood with a sickening clarity. The ritual of remembrance wasn't about simply recalling memories. It was about imprisoning them, distilling their essence of pain and regret, and feeding it into this central mechanism. The old cinema, a place designed to amplify emotions, was the perfect crucible. His grandmother hadn't just been preserving memories. He had been harvesting them, unknowingly, for this parasitic entity. And now, it wanted his essence, his profound, unyielding grief, to complete its manifestation. It's all that's left. But Dean saw through the lie. The pain wasn't all that was left. It was a cage. And the entity was the jailer. The melody shrieked, a piercing protest. He saw the mechanisms, the delicate, intricate pins and cylinders. They were designed to play, to evoke, but also to trap. His mind raced. He couldn't destroy them all, not without knowing what might happen. But he could disrupt the ritual. He could starve it. The entity craved his sorrow, his despair, his inability to let go. With a guttural cry, Dean jammed his hand into the exposed gears of the colossal music box. The metal teeth bit into his flesh, a searing pain, but he ignored it. He twisted, pulling at the delicate pins, snapping them, bending the cylinders. The mechanism shrieked, a sound of agony, as the intricate order dissolved into chaos. The distorted melody faltered, then choked, replaced by a grating metallic screech. Dean felt a profound emptiness open up inside him, not of despair, but of a quiet, terrifying release. He wasn't forgetting his loved ones. He was simply letting go of the grief that had bound him, the very grief the entity had sought to consume. The colossal music box shuddered, then fell silent. The smaller music boxes around it also ceased their subtle, unsettling hum. The entity was gone, or at least profoundly weakened. But the cost was immense. He had won, but the victory felt like an amputation. The shriek, a final rending sound that tore through the very fabric of the air, ceased. Dean's hands, still pressed against the massive music box, felt a sudden, profound stillness emanate from its dark wood. The intricate pins and cylinder, moments before a blur of malevolent motion, were now frozen, silent. A faint, acrid scent, like burnt sugar and ozone, dissipated from the chamber, leaving only the familiar stagnant odor of dust and decay. He stood there, unmoving, for what felt like an indeterminate stretch of time, his breath catching in his throat. The profound silence that followed the entity's last protest was not a comfort, but a new, heavier presence. It settled upon him like a shroud, muffling the distant creaks of the old house, the faint rustle of leaves outside. The air, once thick with an unseen pressure, now felt thin, almost brittle. Residue. His gaze swept the room. The room felt empty. He could feel the absence like a phantom limb, a persistent ache where the entity's presence had been. It was gone, he knew, but the victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion. Dean moved, slowly at first, testing the floorboards. Each step was deliberate, his muscles stiff, protesting. He found himself walking with a slight list, as though the world itself had subtly shifted on its axis. He made his way to the manor's grand entrance, the journey through its familiar, decaying halls now imbued with a strange, detached quality. The portraits on the walls, once seeming to glare with accusation, now held only the vacant stares of painted eyes. The ornate furniture, formerly imbued with an unsettling stillness, was merely old, forgotten. The house had shed its skin of malevolence, revealing the mundane rot beneath. Yet, he felt it. A faint echo, a whisper at the edge of his perception. He felt it in the subtle tremor of his own hands, the persistent hum behind his eyes. He had touched it, wrestled with it, and a part of it had imprinted itself upon him. He pushed open the heavy front door. The sunlight, harsh and uncompromising, struck him with an almost physical blow. It was too bright, too loud. The chirping of unseen birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. These ordinary sounds were suddenly amplified, grating. He squinted, his eyes unaccustomed to the world beyond the manor's gloom. The air, fresh and clean, tasted foreign, devoid of the manor's particular musty sweetness. He did not look back at the house. He simply walked, one foot in front of the other, down the overgrown driveway, past the crumbling stone gates. Hours later, the sun dipping low, Dean found himself on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. The buildings were slumped, their paint peeling, their windows like vacant eyes. A single structure, more dilapidated than the rest, caught his attention. An old cinema. Its marquee, rusted and half-fallen, still bore a faded title. The letters illegible beneath layers of grime. The double doors, once grand, now hung askew, revealing a cavernous, lightless interior. He paused, a strange pull drawing him towards it. He peered through a broken pane of glass. The seats were torn, the screen a tattered canvas. He felt a shiver, not of fear, but of a profound, disquieting recognition. It was a place where memories had been consumed, just like the manor. He pressed his palm against the grimy glass. He looked like a man who had seen too much, a man who carried a weight that no one else could perceive. The world had not changed. He knew that intellectually. The sun still rose, the birds still sang. But he had changed. The veil between what was real and what was merely perceived had thinned to gossamer. The entity might have been banished from the manor, but it had left its mark on him, a permanent scar on his psyche. He pulled his hand away from the glass. The air outside the old cinema felt thick, heavy with the unspoken. He understood now. The entity was not truly destroyed, merely scattered, its influence diluted. It existed in the forgotten places, in the echoes of despair, in the silent, crumbling monuments to lost time. And a piece of it, a fragment of its terrible knowledge, now resided within him. He was a vessel, a living memory of its hunger. The music boxes were silent, the manor cleansed, but the music, a faint, discordant hum, would play forever in the chambers of his mind.